Cool. Welcome back from lunch, everyone. Next up, we have the Frontier Developments team, Will, Tim, and Andy, presenting an authentic F1 experience.
Hello, audio room. Thanks for coming to the talk. As it says, we're going to be speaking about presenting an authentic F1 audio experience in F1 Manager 22. Is the game we're going to be talking about. So a quick overview of the talk. We're going to be describing the game pillars as that sort of informed what we're doing. We're going to then look at the onboard audio treatment versus the trackside car audio. We're going to talk about how we harvested the audio samples for this, and we're going to describe the asset metadata pipeline, which was key to this whole system. We're going to talk about how we generated Y structure. Then we're going to talk briefly about the runtime system and hopefully tease out a few takeaways for you. So just to introduce ourselves, this is Tim Bartlett. He's the lead audio designer on F1 Manager. To my right, we have Andy Hare, who's the senior technical designer on F1 Manager. And myself, I'm Will Auger. I'm the head of audio tech at Frontier. Now, although us three will be presenting today, we're going to be talking about work that a whole team of people did. Audio designers, technical audio designers, we had automation engineers, audio programmers, audio testers, really the whole Frontier audio team coming together for this piece of work. So I'm going to hand over to Tim.
All right, thanks, Will. Okay, so those of you not familiar with the game, F1 Manager is, unsurprisingly, an F1 management game. You take on the role of team principal and control aspects of the team, but for the purposes of the talk, basically you get to experience the races on race day in a broadcast style. So you get various different kind of TV-style cameras in the game, and that's kind of an important aspect of our brief for the game, whereby graphics and audio were given the brief for basically to be in a broadcast style. So from an engine perspective, it's basically make them sound like they do on TV. Easy, right? So basically, obviously, authenticity is key. It's a licensed game, so we want everything to be realistic. So essentially, our approach for this, go back to that, instead of what you would normally do, and what I've done many times in the past, is you would get like your recorders and your mics out and you go and record the cars. We didn't do that. So essentially what we've done is we've gone a completely opposite direction, and instead of using kind of traditional methods to recreate like a broadcast sound, which I've tried to do before, we've actually taken the actual broadcast sounds instead and tried to use those as source material, because if we're trying to recreate that type of sound, then why not use that? On top of that, we've had hours and hours of footage from F1. So we should try and use that if we can. So the whole thing is kind of like an audio reconstruction job, if you like. We're going to break apart the broadcast sounds and we're going to try and reuse them. So the first thing we're going to have a quick look at is the onboard audio. So this uses Rev, middleware, and Wise, which is a pretty standard approach in games now. A lot of games use it. But what you would normally do is you would take your exhaust and engine recordings and you'd feed those into Rev. And what we've done instead is we've basically taken the TV broadcast and fed that in directly instead. We've obviously had to kind of edit that to be like a Rev-friendly format, but the beauty of Rev is basically that whatever you feed into it is pretty much exactly what you get back out the other end. So we've got a quick demo of that. So what you'll see first is the footage that we used for Rev, and then the second is that same car and the same straight from the game. So we'll have a quick look at that. way more basic. So basically, you can hear we've added like wind and transmission and stuff, but the core kind of engine tone itself, hopefully you can hear, is pretty much identical. And the reason it's identical is basically because we used that source material in the first clip for it. So pretty early on, we had kind of a solid plan for the onboard cameras, and we should be able to get very, very close to what it sounds like on TV. So moving on to the trackside car audio. So we've got like one camera left, which is basically like the trackside of the cars going past, which is a much, much more difficult problem to solve. So we're going to talk about pass-bys in the rest of the talk. So just so we're all on the same page, what we mean by pass-bys are one of these. Okay, so again, what you would normally do is you would normally take your kind of recordings that you've made and you'd attach them to the car. You'd use like Doppler and EQ and reverb to basically process the sound as it whizzes by, and you'd have like a simulated pass-by. But before I joined the team, the guys had already started experimenting with using recordings, like we heard in the video there. And they were actually triggering these recordings on the straights in the game, a very early version of the game. And of course, that sounded awesome because it's essentially just a recording of a Formula One car. So that was kind of the gestation of an idea of to use these. And we initially had this idea where basically we would try to use these as much as we could around the track, but there was kind of an assumption that we would have to drop back to kind of using rev at some point for kind of difficult parts of the track, which was really what we didn't want to do because we knew that we would end up with like straights and stuff sounding awesome and the other stuff sounding not so awesome. So it seemed kind of, I mean, the other thing to mention really is the fact that we get hours and hours of footage from F1. We get all the practice sessions from every race weekend. So we've got a massive library of stuff now. And these like pristine recordings with no commentary. So let's try and use them. So we pressed on and tried to figure out ways of matching these like pass-by sounds to corners, which proved to be much more difficult than straights. You needed to have kind of a notion of what was before the corner and what was after the corner. And so basically some of our tests worked, some didn't. So we ended up kind of concluding that we needed to basically come up with a much more sort of scientific, data-driven way of describing these pass-by assets in order to basically map them back onto the game. So we ended up looking at these online. So these are basically just circuit maps. This happens to be Bahrain. And as you can see, we've got all the different corners marked, but we've actually now got a speed and a gear for each corner. So this is kind of promising because it gives us some actual data to work with. So if we harvest sounds from these corners, we can now at least attach some data to it. So we ended up using gears rather than speed because when you listen to a recording, you can get a notion of what gear the car is in, but you can't really hear how actually fast it's going. So it was kind of this point that the sort of penny dropped to me that this system was definitely kind of viable. I was a little bit skeptical to start off with as to whether we would be able to use it all the way around the track. But when you kind of think about the fact that the graphics guys, as well as us, were given the brief of making this like a broadcast, you kind of realize that the visuals are going to basically look very, very close to what the footage looks like. So the tracks are going to look the same and the cars are going to look similar. They're going to move in a similar way and they're going to go a similar speed. And the cameras used are also going to be similar. So why wouldn't you be able to take, say, you know, a recording from one of the corners on this track and then map it back onto that corner in the game? If both the cars are going flat out in both instances, that should definitely work. It's worth pointing out that we weren't trying to do that. We weren't trying to basically have a one-to-one mapping. You know, there was no way we were going to be able to get assets for every corner of every circuit because there's like 22 circuits. So that was never going to happen. So we needed kind of a flexible and a smart way of describing the assets using metadata, so that we could basically say, okay, well, yeah, use that asset on that corner, but then if there's a similar corner on a different circuit, then that can also share that sound as well. So we'll go through the metadata in a sec, but we also need a way to basically sync these up. So what we ended up doing was we have like a notion of a crossover point in the assets. And this is basically just a WAV marker, which is entered into the middle of the sample somewhere. And it's basically the place that the car is closest to the camera. So if we have a quick look at this, skip that. So this is the same pass-by we saw earlier, but with basically a WAV marker. So we're going to attempt to line that up in the game. And as kind of a sanity check, a very early sort of version of the game here, we basically took a capture of the game, took a load of assets that were single assets, laid them onto a capture of the game, and just tested to see whether this would kind of work, and it would give us kind of like a TV flavor sound. So in this video, you'll see the WAV markers are the little red dashes. So that sounded pretty good. So this kind of gave us the confidence to kind of press on with this. So we basically kind of finalized the metadata that we're using, and here's an example of that now. So this is one of the files that we used in the first game. The first bit of this is basically where the asset came from. So this is basically from Bahrain, and it's from turn 14. We know this is like a third gear corner from the circuit map that we saw earlier. Encore is basically, we've got some descriptions for the type of camera that this came from. So we've got like floor and straight and wall and things like that. ME is like Mercedes, so it could be Ferrari or Red Bull. RS was race speed, so we've got different speeds of pass-by, so we've got different speed buckets. The vast majority are race speed, because 98% of the time the cars are going at race speed. But we also have like safety cars and in-laps and out-laps and damaged cars in the game. So there are times when the cars are going slower, so we want them to sound like they're going slower. And the information at the end is basically describing what's inside the asset. So in this particular example, the asset starts with the car in 7th gear. We decelerate towards the crossover point that we just talked about, and it's in 3rd gear at that point. And then we accelerate towards the end of the sample, and we end up in 7th gear again. So even just those kind of 9 characters basically tell us that the car is going really fast at the beginning, it slows down in the middle, and then it goes really fast at the end again. So we can actually have a listen to that. And we can also verify, basically, if you see here, this is BA14.3, and we can see on the map here, bottom right, this came from turn 14, which is the 3rd gear corner, and we can see basically that there's a straight before and a straight after, and that's why it was in gear 7 at the start and at the end. So this all seemed to kind of have a pretty solid plan. I now just basically need to make all of these assets. So just a small thing. So basically, I take the practice sessions that we get from F1, they're usually like an hour long, hour and a half, stick them in Reaper, mark like regions for all the things that might be useful, and then stick the WAV markers in the middle, which is all like the red splodges. And then in the kind of regions box there, need to basically populate this with all the metadata that we just saw. That's quite a daunting process because you essentially have to watch the regions. You have to kind of try and identify where the car is on the track, what turn, and then get the gear number from the map. And you can guarantee that when you first look at these things, you've got absolutely no idea which corner's which. But you can guarantee by the time you get to the end, you know every single corner intimately. Just glance at them and yep, that's turn 7. So once we've done that, we render all those out. So they get rendered out to their metadata names. We then put fades on the start and the end, and we edit them to mono files. So we want them as mono files because we want to attach them to the car as they whiz past the camera. And then it's removing noise from the asset. So invariably, there's all sorts of noise going on in the practice session. The main thing that we have to remove are basically other cars. So obviously, you've picked out this asset, but there can be like 19 other cars on the track at the same time. So invariably, there'll be a car fairly close, ahead or behind. and you'll basically get the asset will be infected with the other car. So if we've just got a quick example of that here. So it's pretty self-explanatory, but there's a little bit of a trace of a car at the start of the file you'll see, and you'll see that we can just basically completely remove that in RX. So we've got that there. And so we can basically just delete them. So they're gone completely. And there's little bits in the middle there that we've removed as well. Kind of do the same for like helicopters and all sorts of stuff. So that's pretty much it. The last step is to get all these assets and stick them through like a batch normalize so that we've got a consistent volume throughout. And we've now got basically thousands of assets. They're all named with the metadata that we've looked at and ready to go in the game. So how on earth do we play them back? That's over to Andy.
Thank you, Tim. So now we have effectively a massive sample pool full of thousands of assets that Tim has delivered for us. The next part of this is trying to match those recordings to anything that happens in the game. This is just a broad map of this whole pipeline that I'm about to talk about. There's like a miniature version of this on each of the slides, just to kind of help you kind of keep track of where we're talking about. In order to kind of gather information from these recordings, we create some scripts that will basically scan through this pool that Tim has sent to us. It will also grab the tags and the WAV marker, and it will also store all of this information in a data asset, which for us was on the game side and Unreal. This ends up being quite similar to something like a sound library, or something that you might have in your DAW for recordings. It stores all the characteristics and tags. So this is what that looks like. The key thing here is it's quite easy for other scripts or tools to read this data. So crucially, that lets the game kind of find out, information about the recordings. What we don't have yet, though, is good information from the game itself as to which of these recordings it should play and when. So something that we realized quite early on, and Tim's touched on this as well, the gearing of the cars was a really crucial bit of information for us. The gear that a car is in, and also the gear kind of sequence that occurs in one of these recordings, tells us so much about the speed of the car, the behavior of it, what its intentions are. And we kind of found out that this kind of start, middle, and end setup, where you have a starting gear, a middle gear. That mid gear can also be the sync point in many cases, and an end gear. This kind of is the kind of paradigm that we found fits most of the recordings, and it's also the most reusable. So this is how we started tagging a lot of these recordings. There were situations where there's a bit more complexity than that. There's like chicanes and S-turns, where there's a lot more going on than just a start, middle, and an end. But in general, that kind of start, mid-end idea was the most reusable. So that's kind of what we settled on. Finding this kind of like really high value tag, I think is something that's a good takeaway from us. If we're going to use tagging systems in the future, finding small tags like this that kind of encapsulate a lot of useful information in a single tag will be something we look out for. So yeah, this is just a visual of exactly what I'm talking about, really, just laid out on a track. So yeah, we now have a lot of data about the actual recordings themselves. We now need game side information. So what kind of data can we pull from the game simulation in order to actually like match up the recordings in the right places? So for some context, and as Tim mentioned, we have fixed camera positions. So each track has set positions where the cameras will be. So it's not like a free cam where you can just fly around anywhere. The tracks themselves are also broken down by splines. Or sorry, they use splines. These are kind of the lines that the cars will follow when they're going round. They define the limits of the track and also the kind of racing lines and that sort of thing. Those splines are broken down into nodes. There can be hundreds of these nodes on each of the splines. And we can use those numbered nodes as kind of trigger points or sync points when we're kind of syncing these recordings. And we also need some gearing information from the game itself. In this case, we're actually assigning gearing information to the game simulation. And we derive some of that from actual real-life recordings of cars and how they kind of behave, similar to Tim's gearing map that he showed before. So we now have a set of recording information and some game data as well. We're now in the process of kind of combining these things. This kind of combination process starts with something we call pass-by definitions. In short, this kind of relates a camera, again, fixed position camera, to gearing information and node information and this sort of thing. Yeah, this is all collated in another database, another data asset that other tools can communicate with and grab information from. And then we're moving into kind of the matching process now. So we have all of these definitions and recording data. We now actually want to try and match those two things together and actually get recordings into lists per camera for each of the tracks. So we're trying to streamline that process. We need it to be automated. And we also have some considerations, like, for example, we want to use WISE still. So we want to be able to use random containers, switch containers, RTPCs, all this sort of thing. We don't want to have to recreate that ourselves. We also want tweakability. So, for example, if you have like tolerances where you don't necessarily need a perfect match of a recording, you can kind of give it bounds within this range. This kind of recording will suit our needs. And we also want reporting. So if there's not enough variation in certain places, or there's missing assets in certain places, we kind of want to know that that is the case, so we can then eventually kind of address that by filling it up with additional recordings. So yeah, this is just kind of a visual, just kind of demonstrating that. We have audio metadata, which is taken from the recordings themselves. That's all the tagging data, WAV marker, etc. Game metadata, including camera, nodes, gearing, that sort of thing. And it's kind of producing these lists of recordings for each of the cameras. So yeah, we now have lists of recordings for each of the cameras. These came in JSON form. This was all developed by a script by our automation team. And we now need to somehow get those recordings into WISE in some kind of sensible structure. To do this, our automation team delved into something called WAPI, which is WISE's API. This lets you kind of interact with WISE in an automated way and kind of generate WISE project structures and that sort of thing. So they went ahead and did this and basically took all these JSON reports and built a WISE structure out of it. It includes like all the hierarchy, like includes the actor mixer hierarchy and events and soundbanks, conversion settings, all this sort of thing. And that produced quite a lot of stuff in our WISE project. 350,000 sound effects objects, 22,000 random containers, 3,000 switch containers, 750 events. It was quite a stress test, took quite a while to run. Yeah, it couldn't have been done manually, so great that we had that. This did throw up some issues just for that structure alone. When you load that in at runtime, it's 100 megabytes of structural data, which is ridiculous. Never mind the media, which is like 150 to 200 megs per track. Yeah, it got quite out of control. We had to kind of break things down a bit and kind of manage it with a bit of dynamic bank loading. We also had to cut back on variation whilst we were still actually loading the media into memory. However, we eventually did manage to just stream a lot of this media, which just massively helps in terms of bringing back some of that variation that we had to cut before. So yeah, we now have effectively a bunch of events, a bunch of sound banks, everything that you need to kind of play something in game. So I'm going to move on to Will, who's going to talk about runtime.
Great. Thank you very much, Andy. Yeah, so we've got everything, all the metadata, we've got the WISE structure, we've got things in sound banks. What happens at runtime? Well, the main thing that happens at runtime is we want to trigger the right audio at the right time to match the visuals. I guess you can sort of apply that to a lot of things, but this is certainly the case here. The runtime side of things was implemented mainly in C++. We did have some stuff in Blueprint as well, some of the more audio designer facing parts. And as Tim said, this trackside pass-by system, it runs in parallel to the onboard treatment that you heard right at the start. So at any point, the player can flip back to the onboard camera and get that that sort of more traditional car audio sound. So the audio emitter setup for the pass-bys was pretty straightforward. Each car had a pass-by emitter that all the sounds were triggered on. So as the car with the emitter moves around the track, the sounds that we play back there get the right spatial treatment. We apply various environmental effects, things like reverb, to the emitter based on the car's position. And as each car has a single pass-by emitter triggering sound, that's about 20 emitters in a typical race. That's fine from a voice management perspective. We don't need to do any fancy culling or anything like that on this game. So we set the engine manufacturer switch on the emitter when the car's instantiated at the start of the game. And this allows us to play back pass-by samples from the correct real-world manufacturer. And this really helps with our authenticity pillar of the game, and certainly one the F1 fans really value. So on to dynamic data. The main dynamic data we send, of course, is the events that get posted, and Wise will then choose us some audio related to that event. As we want the audio to sync with the visuals, we wait until the active camera changes in the game, and then we try and figure out when to post the event. We're aiming to trigger the audio, so as the playback reaches the crossover point in the sample, you can see it at the bottom of this picture. It matches up with the car visually passing by the camera or the crossover node, as you can see just above there. So the first thing we need to do is find the nearest trigger node on the track. So as the camera changes, we try and calculate where this is. It's the point on the track that when the car reaches it, we're going to trigger that audio. So this could be in front of the car, as you can see in this example, in which case the car will reach it at some point in the future. Or it could be behind the car as the camera changes, in this case, in which case that triggering has already happened in the past. So we need to figure that out. So using the nearest trigger node, we estimate the time the car will take to reach the point in the track that's closest to the camera or the crossover node, as you can see here. And this time will be some positive value if the car has not yet reached the camera, or it will be a negative value if the car has already passed the camera when that camera changes. As we're trying to predict what the car will do in the future, we can't just use the current car speed to make this estimate. We have to estimate how the car speed will vary over the rest of the track until it reaches that crossover point. So we use the track sections metadata that Andy described, the gearing, the acceleration behavior, as well as the car's actual speed to get an approximate speed over the remainder of the track. Essentially, this special source scales the time to crossover node, and it gives us just better sync, basically. That's the upshot. We also have a per camera tuning value. So for every single camera on every single track, there's a value that designers can tweak just to get a really get that sync as good as possible. Okay. So we now have certainly a better idea on when to post the event. We just need to figure out what event to post. This is quite a lot simpler. It's really just the track name concatenated with the camera name. And that gives us a unique event for each camera, which we've populated with appropriate samples in the Y structure. Then we post the event on the emitter, as I said, and we sign up for the duration callback from Wise. And basically, we get this when Wise has picked the specific sample that it's going to play, and it can give us the duration of that sound and also some other custom properties. And we use these in the duration callback to basically calculate if the sample that we're playing needs to be delayed. So we would delay it if the car's some way away from the camera, or if we need to seek in that sample, say the car is very close to the camera and we need to kind of skip forward in the sample. Again, we're aiming for the audio playback to reach the crossover point in the sample, in the bottom portion there, as the car reaches the crossover node on the track. So we set some other bits of dynamic data just to kind of get things sort of nice and just sort of increase this idea of sync with the visuals. We set the race speed throughout the race, just so we're picking from different sample pools. If the car's really pushing, going for it at race speed, or maybe they're coasting, there's a safety car, something like that. And as I mentioned, we set various sort of RTPCs to do things like environment-based reverbs, but also we set car speed and camera height just so we can tune the mix. To as I say, to just increase that kind of sync with the visuals. Just a quick note on the fact that we, because we use WAPI to create a Y structure, we didn't go the external sources route, if you know what that is, which was great from an audio code perspective because we didn't need to implement switch containers and all that kind of stuff. Made the code simpler, which was good. Okay, so that's really how the runtime system works. Let's have a look and a listen to F1 Manager 22 in action, and hopefully you can hear the results of what we've been talking about. Okay, there we have it. Thank you. Yeah, cheers. So we've, hopefully that's given you some insight into the system, hopefully some inspiration. I think we'll probably have some time for questions, maybe a few minutes, but thought we'd just try and tease out some takeaways from the work that we've done. Perhaps I'm a little biased on this one, but I think this work really shows the benefits of investing in audio tech, in your audio coders, your technical designers, automation engineers, and testers. The team really came together to deliver this quite ambitious technology stack, and it simply wouldn't have been possible without them. So that was a big one for us. On the subject of teamwork, I think it's useful. It's a useful takeaway to foster genuine teamwork. So although it's great to have a superstar technical audio designer or coder, but having multiple devs working in parallel on something really unlocks some productivity wins. Of course, potential pitfalls there are if people are working in parallel, then they're sort of isolated and they're sort of working in silos. So for your audio tech team to work best is when they're sharing the wins, the progress, the issues. And if you do that, then the team can work in a pretty agile fashion and sort of minimize wasted work. Yeah, it was hugely important to let our audio designers dream big, especially at the start of this, and let the design pillars of the game, like the broadcast presentation style for F1 Manager, to let that define the tech. This ethos allowed our technical devs the creative space to innovate and to come up with these sort of novel tools and pipelines and approaches. Of course, dreaming big is great, but it's important that we kind of mitigate risk by spending time in the prototyping phase and kind of going piece by piece. You get an incremental view on what's possible and what's not possible. We also had a fallback strategy in our back pocket with this, where we could have used the onboard treatment, the kind of classic treatment. But when you get to a certain point, the sort of point of no return, you really need the team to sort of commit and really to all buy into getting this new system to ship it. Yeah, iteration. Iteration was key to this work, both creating the system, but also rolling it out across the game. Particularly when it came to authoring the metadata that Andy talked about to ensure we get this really good sync. The team focused on making the pipelines run as smoothly as possible with various reports and automated tests. This was certainly a win from a productivity perspective, but also from a sanity perspective of the developers involved. Last up, we feel this is one of the most exciting aspects of our endeavors on this. The technique used for the trackside audio treatment on F1 Manager, we think it could be used in other areas of game audio. Anywhere where there's a large body of samples, either that you've harvested from some real world footage or that you've bespokely created, and you're able to author metadata to describe those samples and stuff that's happening in the game world, then we believe you can use pattern matching and the sort of runtime sync part that I talked about to unlock some really interesting possibilities. We've actually incorporated some of this stuff into our dialogue systems, but we think there's further scope for rolling this out into other areas. Okay, thank you very much. That's the end of the talk. So I think we do have a few minutes. Somebody's holding up. I can't see because of the lights.
3 minutes.
3 minutes. So yeah, if anybody has any questions, I'd be happy to answer them.
Hiya, that was a great talk, thank you. I'm interested in how you were tuning the individual corners. I know you said there's sort of a fudge factor for designers to mess with there, but I'm making an assumption here that you're listening for a marker callback to see when it's actually hitting the crossover point. So you've presumably got quite a lot of automated data about how efficient the syncs are. Can you just talk a bit more about how you tuned them from there?
Yeah, so I guess the biggest tuning aspect of it would be the gearing. We have a lot of control over, the gear that we expect for that individual recording. So that kind of dictates a lot of the speed and that sort of thing. We also have kind of just raw tuning values, which is like in milliseconds. How much do you want to add to the prediction for this particular camera and corner? Or do you want to subtract some in cases where it just feels a bit like late or a bit early or whatever? So yeah, we have kind of a few knobs to kind of tweak for that sort of thing.
And it's interesting you mentioned the automation side of it, because that's something we're thinking about as a future development. So we could obviously harvest all of the data and then actually see, well, when did it actually cross by the camera? and then we can sort of get a huge amount of data and potentially sort of tune the system that way. So yeah, that's a really good point. Thank you. Any other questions?
Thanks, guys. That was a really interesting talk. I just had a quick one for Tim. You mentioned that for the broadcast recordings, you sort of folded them down into mono and attached them to the car. I was just curious if you considered kind of keeping them as stereo and playing them back like 2D to like maintain the sort of broadcast stereo, and like if so, why not?
I guess, you know, it's really unpredictable what's going to happen in the game. You've got no idea where the car's going to be going and stuff. And also, the actual recordings themselves, they're not kind of perfect stereo either. You know, they don't always go from like left to right or right to left. Some of them are always on one side and some are always on the other side. And they're also encoded in like surround. I think they're like Pro Logic or something, because they're obviously intended for TV. So there's funny kind of phase ordering stuff going on in there as well. So you can't even when we do the folding to mono, you can't do that in a like an automated process, because basically half the audio just completely disappears. So you have to actually reject the parts that you don't want and then mix them together so that you end up with like a coherent signal. So yeah, especially for kind of future wise, we intend to make the position of the actual pass by much more accurate as well, and therefore, in order to be able to do that, it definitely needs to be mono. So
great, I think that's it. So thank you very much, everyone. Cheers.